People love seeing you two on the screen together.
You think so?
Yeah, I do. I think it's
What
been...
makes you...
Robert Redford has always been more than a movie star. He was the kind of man who didn't need to try too hard. His charm, his independence, and his confidence did all the work. On screen, he could make an audience fall in love with just one look, but off-screen, his story was filled with moments of love, heartbreak, and women who left a lasting mark on his life. These weren't just quick romances or names in passing. They were women who mattered, women who stayed with him long after the world moved on. So who are the 6 women Redford admits he could never forget, and what made them unforgettable? Join us as we peel back the curtains. Lola Van Wagenen. Robert Redford has always been more than just a pretty face. He was the golden boy of Hollywood, the kind of man who didn't have to chase attention because it followed him everywhere. With that sandy blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a confidence that spoke louder than words, Redford embodied the leading man every studio wanted, and every woman couldn't resist. On screen, he could win you over with a single glance. Off screen, though, the story was far more complicated. A life shaped by love, tragedy, heartbreak, and women who left an imprint so deep he could never forget them. Unlike many of his contemporaries, the Warrens, the Brandos, and the Hollywood playboys who lived for the headlines, Redford never flaunted his private life. He was guarded, deliberate, and careful to shield his heart from the press. Yet when you look closely, there are 6 women who truly mattered. 6 women who stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. These weren't fleeting romances. They were chapters in his life, some filled with passion, some with pain, but all unforgettable. So who were they? Keep watching to find out. For all the countless crushes he inspired during the height of his stardom in the 60s and 70s, Redford's first great love came long before he was anyone's leading man. Long before the world called him Sundance, long before his face was plastered on movie posters, there was Lola Van Wagenen. She wasn't a Hollywood starlet. She wasn't famous, and she didn't belong to that fast-moving, intoxicating world. She was a girl from Utah, smart and passionate, with a quiet strength that would define her own path in time. And for Redford, she was unforgettable because she had been there at the beginning, when all he had was raw ambition and an uncertain future. They met in Los Angeles in the late 1950s, when Redford was just 20 and she was 17. He was living in an apartment building, an unknown artist still fumbling his way through life. She was drawn to him in a way she couldn't quite explain, and before long, the two were inseparable. In 1958, they eloped in Utah, the place that would later become such a cornerstone of Redford's personal and professional life. Lola was Mormon, deeply connected to her roots, and she didn't just bring him love, she introduced him to a place that would end up shaping his legacy. Their marriage was young and reckless in its timing, but built on something genuine. Lola herself later recalled that she was just 19 when they wed, dropping out of college to follow him to New York City as he tried to break into acting. At the time, he was no one. There was no fame, no fortune, just a young couple building a life from scratch. For her, it meant leaving behind security. For him, it meant risking everything to chase a dream. Together, they stepped into the unknown. A year later, in September 1959, they welcomed their first child, a son named Scott. It should have been the beginning of a joyful chapter, but fate had other plans. Just months after his birth, tragedy struck. Their infant son died of sudden infant death syndrome. The loss shattered them. For Redford, it cut especially deep. He later admitted that the grief consumed him and that he saw it almost as retribution, a punishment for choices he had made in his own reckless youth. He spiraled, carrying the weight of guilt and depression and turning to alcohol and pills to numb the pain. This tragedy wasn't the only shadow he carried. Redford had already lost his way once before, expelled from college and stripped of his baseball scholarship because of his drinking. Now, with his first son gone, he found himself reliving that same sense of failure and despair. Even as his career began to take off, his personal life carried an ache that never really left. Lola, meanwhile, carried herself with quiet strength. While Redford drifted into his work and his demons, she focused on building stability where she could. She would later confound the environmental organization Consumer Action Now, In 1970 and, decades later, Clio Visualizing History, a nonprofit dedicated to education. Her interests weren't just sidelines to her husband's fame. They were real, impactful causes that reflected her own drive and intellect. She wasn't simply the wife of a movie star, she had her own voice. And yet their marriage was complicated. Redford, restless by nature, was rarely home. He would disappear for weeks at a time, taking off in his car just to escape the weight of responsibility. He admitted to anger issues, to being a control freak, and to craving attention while hiding his ambition. He was brilliant but difficult to live with. Lola endured it for years, raising their children while he chased the unpredictable rhythms of Hollywood. But even as Redford's career soared with roles in Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, The Sting, All the President's Men, and The Way We Were, his marriage bore the cost of his ambition. On the surface, he was the perfect leading man, always playing heroes, always embodying the masculine ideal. But behind closed doors, he was a man battling inner turmoil, testing the limits of loyalty, and struggling to balance the demands of fame with the needs of his family. And yet Utah, Lola's home state, never left him. He built a family home there, carving out a retreat from Hollywood. And in 1978, he launched the Sundance Film Festival, which would grow into one of the most important cultural events in the world. That, too, was Lola's influence. Her roots became his roots. Her home became the foundation for his legacy. But Redford was never one to stay still. While filming Inside Daisy Clover, he developed a closeness with co-star Natalie Wood, something more than friendship by his own admission. By the 1980s, while shooting Legal Eagles, rumors about a connection with Daryl Hannah added fuel to an already strained marriage. Redford himself rarely discussed these relationships in detail, but the silences spoke loudly enough. His marriage to Lola was unraveling, and though they tried, they could not hold on forever. By 1985, the marriage had ended. Redford later described it as mutual, something they both knew was necessary. Yet, unlike so many Hollywood divorces that turned bitter, theirs remained respectful. He credited Lola with giving him a family and a foundation, and he insisted that they parted with love still between them. "We still have great love, great affection, and great friendship," he once reflected, proud that their children had made it through intact. He had wanted to prove that a Hollywood marriage could survive, but ultimately, he couldn't. Lola, for her part, never turned their history into a spectacle. She preferred privacy, choosing to live a life away from the relentless attention that came with Redford's fame. She continued her work in education and activism, built her own career, and kept her voice measured and dignified whenever asked about the past. But decades later, tragedy would come knocking again. In 2020, Redford and Lola shared another devastating loss when their son James died at 58 after a long battle with liver disease and cancer. For Redford, it was another blow that words could barely capture. His publicists spoke of immeasurable grief, but what lingered most was the legacy James left behind as a filmmaker, an activist, and a father himself. Looking back, Redford admitted that his marriage to Lola had saved him at the time. He described marrying her at 21 as something that had kept him alive, even if it could not last forever. She had been the anchor at the start of his storm, the partner who endured the best and worst of him. And though the marriage ended, she was never just a chapter he closed. She was part of the story that defined him. For Robert Redford, Lola Van Wagenen was not just a wife. She was the first great love, the one who believed in him before the world did, the one who stood by him through tragedy and triumph. Their love may not have lasted forever, but it was unforgettable. Cathy O'Rear. Robert Redford's life after Lola Van Wagenen was anything but simple. The divorce in 1985 may have been mutual, but it left a man who was used to being seen as the picture of composure quietly adrift. He had spent more than 2 decades with his first wife, building a family, weathering unthinkable tragedies, and balancing his double life as both Hollywood's golden boy and a restless soul who could never quite sit still. When that chapter closed, Redford was free on paper, but freedom often comes with its own kind of loneliness. By the mid-1990s, that loneliness turned into something else when he crossed paths with Cathy O'Rear. She wasn't a Hollywood starlet looking for a headline. She was a costume designer, someone who understood the industry but worked behind the scenes, far away from the public glare that had followed Redford for decades. For him, that was refreshing. He had already lived through the highs and lows of being married to someone who had to endure life in the shadows of his fame. With Kathy, the energy felt lighter, easier, and less burdened by the expectations that had weighed down his marriage. The two became romantically involved, and soon enough, they were spotted together at public events. For a man who guarded his personal life so fiercely, appearing with Kathy on his arm was its own quiet statement. It meant she mattered, at least in that moment of his life. And though their romance never burned long, it burned bright enough to be noticed. Kathy represented something Redford desperately needed at that point: a breather, a chance to feel connected without the pressure of a long history or the ghosts of the past hovering around him. After decades of carrying grief from losing his son, after years of trying and failing to balance family with fame, after fighting to maintain control over a marriage that finally unraveled, he needed someone who could meet him where he was, in the in-between space. Still, Robert Redford was not a man who lingered in the temporary for too long. His life had always been about moving forward, about chasing the next horizon, whether in art, activism, or love. And before long, his heart was already being pulled in another direction, towards Sibylle Szaggars, the German painter who would later become his second wife. But that doesn't make Kathy forgettable. Far from it. She was there in a moment when Redford was redefining himself after the end of his first marriage. She was a reminder that even the most guarded men need companionship, need someone to step into the silence with them. For Redford, Kathy O'Rear wasn't just a brief fling. She was part of the bridge between the life he left behind and the lasting love he would eventually find. Sibylle Szaggars. From that bridge, Redford walked straight into the arms of the woman who would become his great, enduring love, Sibylle Szaggars. Their story unfolded like fate, quietly but powerfully. They met in the late 1990s at Sundance Mountain Resort, the haven Redford had created back in 1968 as both a retreat and the birthplace of the Sundance Film Festival. Sibylle wasn't an actress or a celeb. She was an artist, a woman with a sharp eye, a restless spirit, and a love for nature. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1957, Sibylle had been making art since she was a young girl, sketching and painting scenes from her travels with her family. Indigenous cultures and ancient landscapes captured her imagination, and she felt compelled to preserve them in her work. By the mid-1990s, she had already created her Buffalo series, striking pieces that showed the environmental threats to the American buffalo. She explained that she used the animal as a symbol for vanishing life, and from the beginning her work carried an activist's voice disguised in the colors of beauty. When she met Redford, she barely knew who he was. She confessed years later that before their first dinner, she rushed to rent his movies, watching 15 minutes of each so she could at least recognize his work. But when they sat down together, he never mentioned his films. For Redford, the fact that she wasn't familiar with his works made him more attracted to her. It meant she saw him not as a movie star, but as a man. He later said it was the perfect beginning, because they connected as equals, without the fog of his fame clouding the moment. Their connection grew stronger as their worlds overlapped in unexpected ways. Redford himself had once dreamed of being an artist. Long before his first film roles, he had spent 18 months in Paris, painting and even sketching on sidewalks for tips. He knew the hunger and vulnerability of that life, the way art could be both freedom and burden. Sibylle's career, which took her from London in the 1980s to the American Southwest in the late 1980s, carried that same hunger, a relentless pursuit of creativity grounded in love for the earth. By 2009, after more than a decade together, Redford and Sibylle married in Hamburg, her hometown, in a private ceremony at the Louis C. Jacob Hotel. Redford wore a crisp white suit, while Sibylle stunned in a champagne-colored gown. Together, they became more than just husband and wife. They became partners in purpose. Environmental activism wasn't just something they both cared about. It was woven into their relationship. In 2015, she founded The Way of the Rain, a nonprofit that fused art, music, and performance to raise awareness about climate change and the fragility of our planet. Redford stood proudly beside her as vice president, blending his influence with her vision. Her work was displayed across the globe, in Europe, Monaco, Peru, Singapore, Japan, and the United States. Every brushstroke, every performance carried the urgency of her message, that the Earth was both beautiful and endangered, and it was up to humanity to protect it. Redford admired that about her. She wasn't afraid to turn art into a weapon for change, and he knew better than anyone that such courage was rare. But life with Sibylle wasn't only about art and activism. It was also about resilience. Redford had endured heartbreaks that never quite faded. He and Lola lost their first son, Scott, to SIDS just months after his birth. Decades later, in 2020, Redford and Sibylle faced another devastating blow when his son James, a filmmaker and activist like his father, died at 58 from liver cancer. Sibylle stood by him through it all, not just as a wife, but as a stepmother and as a steady presence in the storm. For Redford, Sibylle represented the kind of love that doesn't just survive fame. It thrives outside of it. She grounded him, challenged him, and shared in both his private grief and his public mission. Their bond is and has always been about two artists, two activists, two people who see the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. Lena Olin. Before Sibylle entered the picture, before that quiet stability took root, there was another woman who left her mark on Redford's story. She was a woman whose allure was impossible to ignore, even for a man as guarded as he was. Her name was Lena Olin. It was 1990, and Robert Redford was already decades into his career, a legend both behind the camera and in front of it. That year, he stepped into the sultry, charged atmosphere of Havana, a film set against the backdrop of pre-revolutionary Cuba. And it was there, on that set, that Redford crossed paths with the Swedish actress whose striking beauty would stir something in him. Lena Olin wasn't just another actress trying to make her way in Hollywood. By the time she met Redford, she had already made a name for herself in European cinema, working with iconic director Ingmar Bergman, and dazzling audiences with her ability to embody characters with both fragility and fire. She carried herself with that rare blend of grace and danger, a woman who could walk into a room and make the air feel heavier, richer, and more alive. For Redford, who had worked with some of the greatest leading ladies of his era, Lena was different. On the set of Havana, their chemistry was off the charts and undeniable. It wasn't just scripted, it spilled off screen, lingering between takes in quiet moments, in the shared glances that said more than dialogue ever could. By the time filming wrapped, what started as on-screen passion had turned into something real. Redford and Olin began a romance that carried into real life, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a love story born out of the movies themselves. Their relationship stretched into 1991, a period when Redford was navigating both personal transitions and professional challenges. He had lived through the intensity of long marriages and the quiet ache of loss, and Lena represented something fresh, a kind of wild-card energy that broke through. With her, life didn't feel predictable. She brought color, intrigue, and a reminder that even a man who had spent decades in the public light could still be surprised. But their story was not one destined to last. Like the film that brought them together, their romance had a kind of fleeting quality, vivid, intoxicating, but ultimately temporary. Lena's world was shifting too. She was carving out her path in Hollywood while balancing her European roots, and Redford's life was deeply rooted in his own rhythms of activism, filmmaking, and the quiet need for privacy. Yet even though their time together was brief, it mattered. Lena Olin wasn't forgotten because she represented something Redford cherished, passion that felt spontaneous, unplanned, and alive. She reminded him that love could spark when you least expect it, even on a film set where every line is rehearsed and every move choreographed. And for a man who often lived with the weight of expectation, that connection was unforgettable. Sonia Braga. Before Lena, before that Havana heat, there was another fire Redford supposedly couldn't resist: the Brazilian actress Sonia Braga. Their paths crossed in the late 1980s, a time when Redford was expanding his identity beyond Hollywood leading man. He had begun directing, and in 1988 he released The Milagro Beanfield War, a film wrapped in magic realism and political undertones. It was on this set that rumors say something more than creative collaboration took root. Sonia Braga was no ordinary co-star. By the time she met Redford, she was already an international star, a symbol of sensuality and raw talent who had taken Latin America by storm and was beginning to captivate Hollywood. Known as the Brazilian bombshell, Braga carried an energy that was electric, earthy, and grounded, yet luminous with star power. She embodied the kind of femininity that didn't ask for attention but demanded it, a magnetic force Redford, for all his composure, found hard to ignore. The two reportedly began a romance during the making of the Milagro Beanfield War. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about two artists from different worlds colliding at just the right time. Redford, who had built his image as the all-American golden boy, was drawn to Braga's fiery spirit and her individuality. She wasn't trying to fit into Hollywood's mold. She carried her culture, her heritage, and her sensuality with pride. For a man who often lived with restraint, she was freedom personified. But like so many of Redford's loves, the affair had an expiration date. Their romance, said to have stretched from 1987 into 1988, never became a lasting partnership. Still, its intensity made an impact. Sonia was the kind of woman who didn't fade into the background of memory. Her presence lingered. Her passion etched itself into Redford's story as a chapter that burned fast and hot, then quietly closed. For Redford, she represented the allure of unpredictability, a reminder that not every connection has to last forever to mean something. Sometimes, the people who come into your life for only a moment are the ones who leave the deepest marks. And Sonia Braga was one of those women. She was unforgettable not because their romance endured, but because it was impossible to forget the way she lit up the screen and the way, for a time, she lit up his life. Natalie Wood. If Sonia was the flame that burned hot and brief, Natalie was the one who lingered in memory for entirely different reasons. Their story didn't begin on a movie set or at a Hollywood party. It started in the most un-Hollywood of places, high school. Back then, Redford was the golden boy of Van Nuys High, an athlete, a senior, and the kind of kid everyone expected to go places. Wood was already a rising star. But when her path and Redford's paths first crossed, sparks didn't fly immediately. At the time, Redford was working as an assembly guard, manning the doors to the auditorium when a tiny Natalie Wood came running up, late for registration and desperate to be let in. Redford, playing it tough, refused. He later admitted that he was being a complete jerk, caught up in a kind of macho posturing that made him block her way, even as she pleaded. To him, she was just another student, not a star. But to Natalie, his attitude was unforgivable. Frustrated, she snapped, called him an SOB, and stormed off. That was their first meeting, not exactly love at first sight. A decade passed before they crossed paths again, this time under very different circumstances. Redford was no longer just the high school athlete. He was carving out a career on the stage. Wood, now a Hollywood darling, showed up backstage with her then-boyfriend, Warren Beatty, after catching Redford's performance in Sunday in New York. By then, she knew who he was, and more importantly, she saw potential. Natalie Wood, ever the savvy insider, recognized that Redford had something special. She lobbied for him, convincing the studio to cast him in Inside Daisy Clover, the film that would launch his movie career. It was on that set that they went from acquaintances to something deeper. While filming Inside Daisy Clover, he developed a closeness with co-star Natalie Wood, something more than friendship, by his own admission. Redford admired her warmth and kindness. He later reflected that she was, at her core, a genuinely sweet and down-to-earth woman, someone whose realness shone through the machinery of fame. That authenticity drew him in, and a friendship was born. They teamed up again in 1966 for This Property is Condemned, a sultry Southern drama where their chemistry smoldered on screen. Off-screen, they bonded as allies navigating Hollywood. She with her fragility wrapped in stardom, he with his restlessness against being typecast as just another handsome face. Their connection was never just about work, it was about recognition. They saw each other for who they were behind the curtain. Even as their careers soared in different directions, they kept finding their way back. In 1972, when Redford starred in The Candidate, he asked Natalie to do a cameo. She agreed, a testament to the bond they still shared. For years, she was one of those rare people in his life who felt familiar, safe, and unpretentious in a town built on illusion. But like so many relationships in Redford's orbit, theirs eventually faded with time. By the late 1970s, they were no longer close. Their final encounter came in 1980, when Redford was casting his directorial debut, Ordinary People. Natalie, whose career had dimmed, desperately wanted the role of the cold, emotionally detached mother. She believed it could be the part to redefine her. But Redford, ever the perfectionist, didn't think she was right for it. The role would eventually go to Mary Tyler Moore, in a performance that stunned critics. Natalie, disappointed, drifted further out of Redford's life. What lingered, though, was not rejection, but memory. Redford never forgot the girl who had once called him an SOB at a high school auditorium, or the luminous actress who had believed in him when few others did. Natalie Wood was unforgettable not because of romance, but because she represented something rare in his life. Someone who saw the man behind the myth and who gave him the chance to step into the career that would define him. Which name on the list shocked you the most? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.